Hey everybody. Well, we're just about halfway through the course and we're moving into adjectives and adverbs. And I think you're going to feel happy about that. Step away from the nouns and the verbs because those really they make up the bulk of how we communicate, and the grammatical elements of both of those are very complex. So I think adjectives and adverbs still have their complexity, but I don't think it's anything like the nouns and verbs. So this should feel like a vacation. Or maybe not. It's chapter 7 in our book. So let's talk first about adjectives. And the way that Biber and his co authors talk about adjectives is they separate them into the characteristics, whether they can be central or peripheral. And adjectives fall on that sort of a continuum based on how many of these they would have. To be honest, it's not all that critical that you're able to say, well, this adjective is a central adjective. What's more important is to be able to identify and to share with your students um, ways that they will be able to tell what characteristics are appropriate for which adjectives. Um, and they talk about this, I think it's on page 189 in the book, and they give a really nice chart that helps you see sort of the morphology, whether it can be attributive or predicative, how descriptive it is, and whether it's gradable. And the word big has all of those characteristics, whereas the word mere only has one. So you can see that there is quite a range. Now, um, the role of adjectives in sentences. First, as I just mentioned, there's something called attributive adjectives, and that's really the ones that modify a noun. And at least from my perspective, that's when you think of an adjective, that's sort of like the traditional role of an adjective, a big house. That it's something that goes right before a noun. There also are those predicative adjectives, and that follows we're back to the verbs, the copular verbs. And I want to make a point that they sometimes are called linking verbs in some grammar books, especially for students. Um, and and that's one of the issues that you get to think about as a teacher. I mean, do you want to be telling your students that things are called copular verbs, or is that something more for us? In a sense, I look at those kinds of issues as uh, what goes on making us all become mechanics, what's under the hood and what's up on the dashboard. And the copular may be more about spark plugs, and the linking verbs and all those things that they talk about in student grammars are better for the folks who are out there just driving the grammar car. I'm going to leave that image now. um, so they're attributive or predicative. And also, one of the things that I think was interesting to note in our book is that the adjectives are much more commonly used in academic writing and much less common in conversation. And conversely, adverbs are more common in conversation, or it's a larger percentage of what's used in conversation. Uh, and there's some good details about that on page 190. So when we look at how adjectives are formed, what I don't have here on this slide is just the simple adjective that's just a standalone lexical word, like big. But you also then have three other kinds of formation. The first is the participial, and that's where you're using the ed or ing ending verbs, as in interested, interesting. Those can become adjectives. It's an interesting movie. Uh, there's also derivational, um, where you're adding something to a noun or a verb to make it become an adjective. And then there are compounds. And these are two words together. And sometimes they're hyphenated, and I think actually at some point they even lose the hyphen and just become one word, like full time. I think oftentimes can also be used without a hyphen and just as one word. Participial adjectives, that first classification, that's where you can either use the ing or ed endings. Um, and most of those adjectives are coming from verbs. Not all verbs will be able to do this, so that's something that you have to consider when you're talking to students. Do you want them to sort of work on understanding the principle of deriving an adjective from a verb, or do you want to just teach these words, like the word interesting, as an adjective and not even really make that connection that it's a verb? And the reason why I mention that is that oftentimes when you have the participial following the verb to be or some other copular verb, it's sometimes difficult to know whether it's an adjective or a verb. I mean, when you look at it grammatically, you can make the case that it's one or the other. And in a sense, it doesn't matter. I mean, you don't want students to get hung up in that as long as they're using it correctly. But there are certainly students and teachers who want to be able to have a real clear sense of how you describe that, because when you get into those gray areas. And here are the book goes into a lot of detail about what are the most common of these different types of adjectives. And I think this kind of information is very interesting, and this is that connection between vocabulary and grammar, which is sometimes called lexicogrammar, where you get to see what are the things that are most common, and then you get to make choices as teachers and as lesson planners. Do you want to have students really work with a wide range of these? Do you want them just to focus on the most common ones? And it also could be what's most common for your student group. For example, if you're dealing a lot with folks in a rural environment, kids coming from migrant farming backgrounds, there may be particular vocabulary that you think is more important. One of the things that I've certainly noticed is that depending on how you introduce these things, and that's why it's important to think about that, it can be very easily confused by ELLs, by non-native speakers of English. So that you might say, if you're describing a movie, you can say, I was boring, or the movie was bored. Because if you teach these things too closely together, I think it's easy for the students to start to confuse the two. And that's something that can also become fossilized, which means it's something that's sort of, they actually learn something that you don't want them to learn, and it can be very hard to unlearn it. It's a mistake that they have sort of integrated into their speaking and their language acquisition. So I want you to think about that. How would you be able to address that kind of confusion with the kinds of students that you're interested in working with? Moving on to the derivational affixes with adjectives. This is a very, very common way to create adjectives. And sometimes this is a thing, again, when you're thinking about what you do in the classroom, you can have some fun with this because this is one of the creative parts of English. It can be frustrating because sometimes the creativity that we show in trying to create these adjectives, not everyone goes along with, or there's another more common option. And here are some nice examples. Chord goes to chordless. Effect is effective. Continue, continuous. Elude, elusiveness. And those are things that it's good in terms of being able to help students identify when they are reading or listening the kinds of words, if they're able to identify the word class that they belong to, it helps them make sense of the language they're hearing. And then also when they are writing, if they want to try to, move from what they know to start adding new elements, moving, taking the verb and deciding, well, I now want to use that as an adjective to describe a noun. How do I go about doing that? So that's also something to think about. Then there are compounds, and that's where adjectives are made up of combinations of more than one word. There's a complete list of these things in your book on page 192. One of the things I like about that list is it talks about the different classes of words that are combined. For example, adjective and noun and adjective, all these different things that in one sense, certainly for us as teachers, it's good to be aware of that. And there are times when you may want to have your students become aware of that, because it may help them in making sense of sentences if they realize that these things can come together and become adjectives. Let's move over to adverbs. Typically, they modify a verb. that actually helps with the name of the thing, the adverb. But it can also modify an adjective, or it can modify the entire, I put sentence here, but let's call it a clause as well. And when it doesn't, when it modifies the entire sentence or clause, then it's considered the adverbial in the clause. And both adjectives and adverbs are less common than nouns and verbs across all registers. And what the functions of adverbs? It can modify things, as I mentioned, and they're part of an element of the clause, and they typically will modify, as I mentioned, they can modify a verb, but they can also modify an adjective or even another adverb. I'm almost positive she borrowed that off Barbie. Sorry, it's a typo. And then also there's the clause element component, which makes it an adverbial. And oftentimes this can be one word. I think she'll be married shortly. But it can also be, as we know, there can be phrases that are these adverbials. And then the forms of adverbs, there's the simple form, soon or here. And please note that some words can act as adverbs or other word forms, which is something you may want to consider, especially for common words, to help students, because they may learn one way, like the word fast, they may learn it as an adjective, and then they can become confused when it's got those other meanings from different word forms. There are also compound adverbs, where you're combining a couple of words. There's suffixes, and that's kind of another sort of a traditional view of the adverb. It's an adjective with an ly at the end, although, as I mentioned, you can also use things like wise as an ending. And then there are some fixed phrases. They're more than one word, but you can't break them apart. Okay, so that's just a little bit of an overview about adjectives and adverbs. I want you to go through the book and the workbook, complete the exercises in the workbook. Let me know if you have any questions. I know sometimes that can be overwhelming. If you feel you're running out of time, go through, do a couple of the exercises in each part. If you feel like you've got it, you don't have to go through and work through every single thing. If you feel like you really don't have it, you can contact me. And remember, you can contact me by email. You can also contact me via Skype. And if you want to talk and you don't feel comfortable doing it through Skype, you can set something up with me on Skype. Email me, and I can send you my cell phone number, and we can talk also. I mean, that's one of the beauties of this. I mean, I love online learning, but also in some ways it can become quite isolating. So let me know if you have any questions. And remember, I've posted a few things in our discussion board so that you can respond to a few questions. I think there's a couple of items for each person to respond to, and then I want you to respond to each other. This is also, in addition to just looking at the knowledge, it's a wonderful thing for us as teachers when we realize that we sometimes have the same questions. So if you're not sure about something and you ask a question, that actually helps everybody else, because they probably have the same questions, and either they're not able to articulate it, or they feel like everyone else has got it and they don't. And believe me, with a lot of this stuff, I also struggle with this, because I want to teach. We're sort of building this knowledge base about grammar, and it's valuable to have, but it's also something that we need to have that, and then we're going to be working on, well, then how do we work with our students, and not just about grammar, but how is that being integrated into all the other issues that we have to look at as teachers. And so, there are no bad questions, and there's nothing wrong with having doubts, because a lot of this stuff can feel very tenuous. As some of you have already mentioned, none of us, as we were growing up, was having this degree of detail in the grammar that we were learning in our education. So this is all new for all of us. I mean, I think as we read through these things, we notice, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense, or oh, that's surprising, I wouldn't have known how to explain it. But it's nothing that was taught explicitly to any of us. So this is where we're really taking it to another level, and it's understandable to feel a little bit overwhelmed by grammar. Okay, I'll talk to you all soon.